I know he's watching the road or listening in. Great. Welcome to Senate Education, Friday, January 5th, 1:32. For those of us, or for those of you who normally follow us, we're going to try to push these meetings, unless there's objection, forward to starting at 1 o'clock while we have some flexibility around floor time. My error this week, I had hoped to do so with the hopes of sort of having a little more time and maybe wrapping things up a little bit earlier on Fridays. With that, we are now moving into a lot of our work for the session after a couple of brief days of priorities and introductions. We're going to really kick things off by looking at literacy. And we all know literacy has been in the news. It's been I'm sure people may have heard of our constituents, their concerns around literacy rates in this state and the nation. And we have a number of different bills related to literacy. I know Senator Gulick has one. I have one. Senator Starr came to see me today. He has one. And but I thought we would go back to 2 years ago when we passed Act 28, and I believe I'm the only one still left on this committee when we passed Act 28, to understand what we did then. And so we can get a sense of what's been done, and then from there, we can hear an update, which we will hear around 2:15 from the Agency of Education on what sorts of things have been accomplished, what sorts of things, in their opinion, still need to be accomplished. And then we'll wrap the day up with Senator Gulick's bill and some testimony. And in between all of this, we have our old friend, good friend, Jay Nichols here, who was not able to join his colleagues yesterday for an update on what's going on in schools, and so he'll give us some of that update as well. So, Ms. St. James, you've passed out, or our wonderful committee assistant, Morgan, passed out your testimony. I believe it's on our desk. Want to just take us through a little bit on Act 28?
Sure. Good afternoon, Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. You all asked me to come in and kind of walk through Act 28 of 2021. And so what I've done is you should have, actually I don't see it, but on your website, there should be a link directly to Act 28. And I can always share my screen and pull it up if you want. But what I've prepared is just a very high level summary of what the Act actually did.
Great.
And I will say that my testimony is most likely to leave you wanting a lot more. Because walking through the bill itself is, it's going to give you information on what you asked, but it is not going to give you any information on what actually happened.
Sure, and that's why we have the agency coming in after.
Great. Yeah. So the first thing I will just say is, basically, Act 28 did a couple different things. One, it created the Advisory Council on Literacy that we'll talk about. But the big thing that it did is it appropriated COVID money. It appropriated ARPA funds, and then gave the agency directive on how to use those funds. And that is basically what Act 28 did. So that's why I'm saying my testimony, I'll tell you what you told them to use the funds for, but the actual hard work that went into it is not I'm gonna leave it there.
Sure.
So I just started with and there's lots of, if you're interested, and I would encourage you as you begin, if you do dig into literacy this year, I would encourage you to read, there's a purpose section and a findings section to this bill that are actually several pages. So I would encourage you to take a look at those. But I just pulled one blurb right at the beginning of my handout that I think summarized this act, the purpose of this act, and that is to continue the ongoing work to improve literacy for all students in the state, while recognizing that achieving this goal will require a multi-year and multi-dimensional effort, requiring continued focus by the General Assembly, the administration, and the school leaders. I did not write this, I cannot take credit for that, but I think that is a really nice summary of what this bill directs everyone to do. So the first thing, the first kind of meaty section here is that Act 28 required AOE to use ARPA money to do certain things. And so the first chunk of things is the second bullet point here. And it so required professional development, required AOE to use those funds to provide professional development modules in literacy instruction, with specifics on what that literacy instruction needed to include. It required AOE to assist supervisory unions in implementing evidence-based systems-wide literacy approaches that address learning loss due to the pandemic. It required AOE to address learning loss through the implementation of evidence-based interventions that respond to students' academic, social, and emotional needs, and address the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on student groups most impacted by the pandemic, and for whom the pandemic exacerbated pre-existing inequities. And that funding was supposed to be directed to school districts that need additional support as evidenced by their needs assessment priorities in their COVID-19 recovery plans. So that is very big picture, right? There's not a lot of specifics in there.
May I ask, so I think I may have mentioned this to Senator Gulick back in December. I heard, and the agency will confirm this, I had heard that the agency saw this work in some ways as optional. And is it optional, or did we give them some real direction to say, hey, these are our concerns, please address them?
So page 4 of Act 28, and again, I'm happy to share my screen if you want.
It's okay.
But page 4 says the Agency of Education shall use the funding under, and then it refers to the appropriation of this act to, and then everything I just flashed through, and there's a shall there.
Okay. The only thing I can add to this, since I don't think anybody was even here to vote on it, was definitely there were COVID concerns, learning loss. There was a general concern about some testing and some scores. We also heard from teachers who really came before us and said, we do not know how to teach reading. So it was really powerful testimony that we heard, and brave testimony, frankly, for teachers to come before us and say, we really need some help here. And we might be getting to it, so I'll let you continue, but I think there was something about teacher training report. Yes, please, go ahead.
So the next chunk, so there was one appropriation for that work. Again, it was all federal funds. The second appropriation was for a contractor to provide technical assistance to supervisory unions. And again, this is a shall. And the contractor was supposed to provide technical assistance to supervisory unions for the following things. So recommending how those federal funds can be used to implement Act 173 in the context of improving literacy outcomes. Remember, Act 173, I think we think of it mostly when we're thinking about special education funding, but Act 173 also focused on systems of support for all students in need of extra support. So the contractor is also required to provide technical assistance to supervisory unions to recommend evidence-based practices in teaching literacy instruction. That should be in teaching to students in pre-kindergarten through grade 3. Recommending how to provide professional development for teachers and school leaders in methods of teaching literacy, and recommending policies, procedures, and other methods to ensure that improvements in literacy outcomes are sustained. So AOE was given a chunk of funds, allowed to hire a contractor that they could convert into a limited service position, funded by this federal funding. And then what I just walked through is the technical assistance this contractor was supposed to be the lead on. And I will just say, I am not an expert on ARPA funding. I believe the funds need to be, their use needs to be dedicated. I think what you are seeing and hearing out there is that the funds run out September of this year. I think it's slightly more nuanced than that, in that the funds need to be directed to a specific use by then. but still the timeline is narrow and finite. It's not, these funds are not gonna go on forever. And so that particular position was funded through the use of those expiring federal funds. So then the act
Beth,
goes
sorry
on.
to interrupt a second. This might be for someone else. I do not recall the dollar amount that we put toward this.
I can tell you.
Okay.
So what I just walked through was everything AOE was supposed to do. And then the next section of the bill, which begins on page 5, is the appropriation section that all of that work is tied to. And so $450,000 of the ARPA funds were allocated for the contractor. And the act is specific that the contractor, it's supposed to pay for the contractor for fiscal years 2022, 2023, and 2024. So it already, the act itself, not, outside of the limits of the federal funding, envisions this position as only really for those three years.
Senator Sheen.
This might be a question for you, Senator Campion, but I'm curious if we're going to, well, actually, who is the contractor?
We met her last year. I don't remember her name off the top of my head. But we'll have her back in, and we'll also have the secretaries coming in today to kind of give us an update on where things are at with all this.
Okay, great. Because
Do you remember her name?
I don't remember her name, but I don't think she was hired until June of 2022.
It was late. And the only thing I remember, I don't know if this will help anyone's memory, she was maybe from the Midwest.
I remember she was sitting right there.
She was sitting right
Yeah.
there, yeah.
I'm sure we're going to cover it later on today, but I'm really curious as to how the scores have changed since the start of having hired this contractor, and just how that has taken shape in the different SUs. And it was just one person for the entire state, or did she have like a contingency?
As far as I know, it was just the one position, and then I think she had some funds to maybe contract in different ways, but I think the way they were planning on doing it, I think in part because of COVID, but for other reasons, doing a lot of the kind of training online over Zoom, so we can pull that apart a little bit. But your question's exactly right on target around, all right, so this is what we've done. Is it working? Or do we need to beef it up? Do we continue it? Whatever, yeah.
And then just on the money piece, there was
Yeah.
$3,060,000 appropriated for the first chunk of work that I talked about that AOE was responsible for. The professional development modules, the learning loss implementation, the evidence-based systems-wide literacy approaches.
And the modules, back to Senator Hashim's question, I think those are gonna be sort of maybe the most expensive piece, but we'll find out today.
So the next thing this bill did, can I move on?
Yeah, and Senator Dill, did you ever?
No, well, yeah, sure. Just that those professional development modules, that was a mandate from the federal government, is that correct?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I did not, so to prepare for
think
today.
so.
Okay.
But I could be wrong.
So to prepare for today, I just focused on walking through Act 28 itself. But there might, I'm happy to look into that.
Okay, just curious.
Yeah, I'd be curious, yeah. Were the modules specific for literacy, is that what you're wondering? Or just modules?
Yeah, 'cause, I mean, just the way I read it here, it
Yeah.
seemed like it was sort of a mandate in terms of the ARPA fund usage.
Oh,
but
I know that we
could
had
be
to
reading
use it,
wrong.
like they told us, they gave us a range of ways to use it. But I don't know if the feds, it'll be interesting to find out if the feds mandated any of it, or we just use it based on the recommendation.
Okay.
Thanks, yeah.
I'll look into that.
Yeah, that'd be great to know.
And so we've gone through the work that was required, we've gone through the money that was to support that work. So the next thing that Act 28 did is created the Advisory Council on Literacy. And this actually, so the Advisory Council on Literacy was created to improve proficiency outcomes and literacy for students in pre-kindergarten through grade 12 and sustain those outcomes. And they were created to advise AOE, the State Board of Education, and you all on how to do that. And the interesting thing about the advisor, to me, as the nerd sitting here for the drafter, is the Advisory Council on Literacy was actually drafted with a sunset. So it expires, it ends June this year. But it was put into your green books. So it actually lives in the statute right now. So if you take no further action, the Advisory Council on Literacy goes away on June 30th, 2024.
Which, and I'm not asking you to remember this, but maybe Senator Gulick, since you've been teaching for a long time, I think this idea wasn't anything new. I think we had one in this state. It dissolved at one point, and then we sort of recreated it 10 or 12 years later. And so I would hate to see it disappear, and I don't recall the logic behind putting a sunset date on it.
Been a house decision.
Thanks, Senator Sheen. Did everybody hear that?
Just kidding.
There was talk when I was on the advisory to make a move to try to keep it going. So I don't know what happened with that, but hopefully we'll hear
Hopefully
from
we can do it.
yeah.
And I think in one of the articles or somewhere I did see that the state had one maybe 15, 20 years ago, and it just sort of faded. Okay.
I can't speak to that, but I can tell you that there is, chapter 99 in Title 16 in the Green Book is the title of the chapter is General Policy. And that is a horrible name for that chapter. And if you all do any work in literacy this year, I would encourage you to consider changing that chapter's name because it contains the tiered systems of supports language. It contains the Advisory Council on Literacy, and it contains the current reading instruction statute, which does require the state to have a reading instruction plan for the state. And that's been on the books since the late 90s. So it's possible that there was something involved in the beginning related to the statewide plan, but current law says it's the State Board of Education in collaboration with various stakeholders that are spelled out in the statute to develop that plan. So I just listed here, like very basically the membership of the advisory council. There's all of the executive directors that you see there are actually ex officio members, and then there are 8 members who are the field support. Just so you could see what the council is made of. They have annual reports due to you every December 15th. I believe their report is on the legislature's website, and if you have trouble linking to that, I'm happy to send that to Morgan directly. Would that be helpful? Okay.
Sure.
And as I mentioned, if you take no action, the council will, the language that enables the council will automatically repeal on June 30th, the end of the fiscal year. So that's the Advisory Council on Literacy. I'm spending very little time talking about it. There is a lot of language in the act itself on what they are doing, but they are supposed to provide guidance to you, the state board, and AOE on literacy, teaching, outcomes, training, etc. It's a very broad and unsophisticated way to describe their work.
Thank you for that.
The next thing, so there was an appropriation for stipends, and then there was a directive to AOE to honor before October 1st, 2022, to review teacher preparation programs in relation to evidence-based literacy instruction and licensing and relicensing criteria as it pertains to literacy instruction. They're supposed to do that work in collaboration with the Standards Board for Professional Educators, which is the licensing board for teachers. Again, a very simple way to put the work that they do. So then there is I'm going to pause, I'm going to come back to this piece. There is a report requirement by AOE on December 15th of 2021, 2022, and 2023, so you have one coming to you, on the progress of achieving this act. But there is no separate and specific reporting requirement on this teacher preparation, review.
Can you say that again, sorry?
So there's a general reporting requirement for AOE for implementation of the act, updates every year. But there's no separate and specific reporting requirement on that teacher preparation program review. So, as a lawyer, I can argue whatever anyone gives me a little bit of breadcrumbs to argue with. You can argue that that should be included in all of those annual updates, but I just wanted to highlight for you that there's no separate and specific reporting requirement on that. And then the very last thing that this act does is it creates the census-based funding advisory working group, or it amends a small portion of the census-based funding advisory group, which is related to special education funding coming out of Act 173, and it just extends the life of that group for 1 year. And that's it. That's all Act 128 does. I'm sorry, 128 does.
Big help. Yes,
Yeah,
I do it.
That's
Yeah.
great, thank you so much. I see Jay Nichols's name on this other item that I wanna mention, which is the blueprint for literacy, which looks like that came out in 2019.
I was very involved in that.
Okay, yeah, and I was wondering how that played with Act 28, or if it played.
So I think that's a great question for the agency, and I'll tell you, let me just, if you would allow me to tell you why I'm punting on this.
Yes.
The state is required to develop I'm reading right from section 2903 from Title 16, to develop a plan for establishing a comprehensive system of services for early education in the first 3 grades to ensure that all students learn to read by the end of the 3rd grade. The term blueprint for successful reading, or whatever it is called, does not appear in statute. So I would encourage you to ask the agency how that fits into this. My guess is that's part of that state plan.
And I'll try to remember to ask the agency, someone else would as well, it'd be great, is that, the assessment of what's happening in those teacher prep programs. Really appreciate you finding that out, because I did expect some kind of report.
And it might come to you, I
understand,
it
yeah.
might come to you in the overall report that is required on the implementation of this act. But it's a standalone section, and so I just wanted to point out that there's no separate reporting requirement. And that's a good pitch for when you do want that information, when you are drafting, when I'm drafting, and you are giving me direction. If you are really interested in a piece of information, it's always a good idea to ask specifically for a report back on it. Even if you're saying report back on to us on the implementation of this act, you all should be as specific as possible on what you want to get back in order to get what you need to go forward. And I will continue to remind you of that as we draft things.
Thank you. Is there anything anybody wants Beth to just note right now? The only thing if you don't mind, and of course this isn't the committee decision, but I think we'll get to it at some point, ask the committee if we want, I suspect we will want the Advisory Council on Literacy to continue. I would be surprised if the committee doesn't. So if we could just draft that and just get that language, either, Senator Gulick's bill might be the right spot, mine, or miscellaneous, but I have a feeling the committee would not want to see all this work disappear.
Mm-hmm.
The Senate will as well.
I will make a note of that, and you will figure out the right vehicle. That's an easy one.
Anything else that anybody wants to note right now? We don't want Beth to lose sight of before we start digging in a little bit more on this. Yes.
I'm Cynthia Gardner-Morris. I'll be testifying later, but I wanted to point out that on page, are you talking about S204?
Yeah.
I'm not aware.
I will concur on that. All right, thanks so much, Ms. St. James.
You're welcome, and I'm sorry.
This has been an incredible walkthrough, really helpful.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm sorry I can't join you and walk through Senator Gulick's bill. whenever you have time, if that is something that you do wanna take up, I would encourage you to ask me back to do that, just basic walkthrough.
Yes. Yeah, Senator Gulick will,
Great.
generally, and I'll remind Morgan, whenever, yeah,
I just have a
you have a conflict, yes,
a
okay.
conflict that I cannot reschedule.
Absolutely,
I hope you feel better.
yeah, we have to,
Children are a blessing, right?
sure.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Beth. Have a good weekend.
Have a good week. Mr. Nichols, I'm wondering if we, while we're on this topic of literacy, we can always have you back to talk more about what's happening on the, in schools. We heard a lot of this a little bit yesterday, and I know you felt like, at least with conversation with Morgan, you concur with your colleagues. But could we just stick with literacy maybe during this meeting, since you have some experience with the blueprint,
Sure.
and tell us a little bit
Well, I
about?
can tell you, I was a superintendent that was pushing really hard for reading reform as a superintendent.
Would you mind telling us the years, just so?
So it would have been around 1999, 2000, when I became a principal in a school that had very bad reading scores. And Vermont was qualified for an America Reads program back then. And so almost every school in our supervisory union, where I later became superintendent 15 years later or something, received funds. And so several of us got together and put forth a reading program that was a national program, was developed out of Johns Hopkins University, called Success for All. And that program immediately had strong impacts for kids in those schools. I left there to become principal in South Burlington in 2002 or 3, and the program died after I left. And that school, it died in the other schools in that district a couple years later. So I can tell you that part. In terms of the blueprint, that was something that Dan French put together, got a bunch of us together with some federal money. I don't remember who the consultants were that were working with us. We put a lot of time and effort into the blueprint, just getting ready for implementation, and then COVID happened. And Dan said, we're just gonna put this, rightfully so, we're gonna put this on a back burner. And I did not attend any more of those meetings because Governor Scott tapped me to be on the school reopening committee, and we were meeting almost daily. So at that point, I kind of dropped off the blueprint, spent all my time with Dr. Levine and those folks, which is time I hope I never have to spend again.
Sure.
So I was not part of the latest work that's been done on it. I think Gwen Camoli's probably,
She's coming in.
she'd be the best person to talk about whether there's a nexus or not on that.
So just to help you understand, so the John Hopkins program, you implemented in 99, you left about 2003.
3 or so, yeah.
Had you seen some change?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, what was it about, do you think, the program that helped?
The program,
In what grades?
was, well, there was a K through 6 program, particularly effective in K through 3 or 4. Levelized reading instruction for students based on where they were at. The idea behind that program is it's been implemented in a lot of cities and has been successful wherever it's been implemented, but it's also costly and it's kind of expensive. And so I think that's why a lot of places haven't done it. If there's federal money helping to support it, people are more likely to do it. 80% of your staff has to buy into it to implement it. It has to be an anonymous vote. If you refuse to, don't want to vote to implement it, then you can't, no matter what you say as a principal or superintendent. In our case, our test scores were pretty low, and we wanted to see some improvement. Within a couple of years, our test scores were the highest in the district. But it wasn't a program that every teacher loved. I mean, the best story I can tell you is I had some teachers talking in the office next to mine, and I love telling this story. And this first grade teacher who didn't really like the program was complaining about the patient program. She goes, it's not so much fun teaching reading as it used to be and stuff. It really bothers me that we're still doing this. And another teacher said, do you think we should go to Jay and ask to revote? And she said, why would we do that? Kids are already better. And that's the kind of teachers that I love. She wasn't thrilled about the program, but she could see it was having a positive impact on her kids. So, and then I went to middle school and later on became a superintendent and didn't get quite as involved in early ed.
So then I just want to go back to the blueprint then. So what years did Secretary French begin that?
Right after he took over, he started that.
Because I don't remember us talking about it when we did Act 28. So had it been, when you say put on the back burner?
I don't remember anything happening with it at all, other than committee coming out, putting forward this plan.
Okay,
That was supposed to come in place to the legislature, and then with us getting hit by COVID and sending all the kids home. And to my knowledge, nothing really happened with that after that.
okay.
Whether or not that helped inform the work,
28, maybe
Right.
the testimony.
very well might have, hopefully did.
Yeah.
Senator Gill, you raised it, you knew about it. What did you know about it, or was there anything
Well,
that?
only because, and Cynthia can probably speak to it as well, but, it came up in our advisory council work. You know, it was kind of like, it was a document that was referred to a lot, and we generally
It's all
just,
research based.
yeah, but then when I reached out to districts, it just seemed like it hadn't been disseminated.
No, I had it.
Yeah, right, so that's my
Okay.
experience.
Do you remember seeing a copy of it?
Yeah, I mean, you can, it's,
Okay.
you can pull it up.
It's on the AOE
It's
website.
there,
Okay.
yeah, it's there.
Any questions for Mr. Nichols on this topic of literacy?
Yeah, the secretary is not gonna be here probably for another 10 minutes, so let's jump into a little bit,
Yeah.
maybe a high overview of, you probably watched the testimony from Mr. Fannin, you didn't.
No. Mr. Fannin, I have a poster of him in my house, that I look at occasionally, but I don't always watch it. I've been out straight. I've been
No, I
gone,
understand,
so
I
it's,
understand, I've only watched
I'm
it,
not up to
yeah,
speed like I
a few
should be.
times, right.
So I have not seen his testimony, and I also know that Sue was in the
Right.
testimony, and I thought Jeff was too, but guess he didn't.
Maybe next week, yeah, I think somebody in his office might have COVID or, yeah.
Yeah. So I'll just touch on a couple of things real quick. The school,
What you're seeing on the ground in Fort Bridge.
yeah, I was asked by Morgan to touch on the school safety
Great.
bill and what we're seeing on the ground in terms of budget priorities. So those are two things I'm gonna touch on.
Perfect.
And you've got my written testimony is up on your website now. I noticed he just posted it. So I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit and just say in terms of the school safety piece, our rep is David Manning, who's the principal of Johnson Elementary School. Been very involved in that, and I think those folks all did a really good job on that. The one concern that principals have right now has to do with the creation of school behavior threat assessment teams. Not so much the creation of the teams themselves, but it's important to know that schools are in different places, and the law, rightly, has different expectations for schools that already have these teams in place versus school districts who have just started developing these teams. One concern from our members, who are school leaders that oversee the day-to-day operations for Vermont schools, centers around procedures and the policies being in place. A straight reading of the law, certainly the legislative intent of the law, was for the Agency of Education to put forth a policy that included procedures to govern the implementation of behavior threat assessment teams. In the meetings I've been a part of, and granted, I've been out of town the last 3 or 4 days, it seems that the AOE simply plans to refer school districts to a manual, and this manual exceeds over 100 pages. So I'm hoping this does not occur, as my members need simple procedures that are easy to understand. They really don't have the time to be looking through a manual when they're engaging in school safety work, along with a vast multitude of other responsibilities they contend on a daily basis. I think the model policy and procedures are supposed to be to us by mid-December.
That's correct.
I haven't seen a final draft of those yet. I'm sure the AOE is aware of this, working on it, but that is a little bit of concern for my members.
And on that note, if my recollection is correct, Ms. Hedges said yesterday that they do hope to have something out in a couple of weeks,
Okay,
correct?
that's Lindsay Hedges at AOE.
Lindsay, yeah,
Okay.
so, but I appreciate your point, being handed a 100-page manual.
Yeah,
Is-
principals just don't have the time. The principal's world, folks, and I was a superintendent and a principal. Principal's toughest job in education. They constantly get things come out all the time. They're making 1,000 decisions a day.
Yeah.
Simplicity really matters in such
Sure.
a complex endeavor.
We understand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Really? That's good. Budget pressures was the second topic I was asked, so I'm gonna talk a little bit more about that. This is from my members.
Mhm.
I put together a little list of cost drivers. It's incomplete, but pretty robust, and I'll take questions on any of them. There's an increased percentage of staffing costs as filling licensed educator support staff positions continues to be very difficult. So you've got that constant battle between private industry and schools, and more importantly, schools versus schools. Talking to the Missisquoi superintendent today, and she made a comment about how she has to get her salaries up to a certain level so her teachers don't need to go to St. Albans.
Sure.
And then, of course, St. Albans is saying, well, we've got to get our teachers up to a certain level, or they're going to leave and go to Essex.
Get
So
that.
there's that constant dichotomy. Health insurance costs increasing by an average 16.5%. It's a huge cost. Local school districts have no control over that at all. Because we do that at the state level now. There's concerns about how the new pupil weighting system will play out in various communities. We're hearing that all over. I met with the Chittenden County principals maybe 3 weeks ago, and they're all into there. Even the places that think that they're going to be winners with the new formula are thinking that all the different things related to increasing costs and education driving is going to put them in positions where they might be able to just maintain status quo. Whereas other places are saying we may have to cut millions of dollars as compared to kids. So that's certainly out there. ESSER funds going away, but the needs of the children still stark. PCB mitigation and associated costs and ongoing concerns with no real solutions in sight. Along with that, school construction and deferred maintenance issues at an all-time high. So some schools are saying, well, we've tried to save money the last few years to be able to fix those windows in the school or whatever it might be. Now, if we do that, that's a cost that drives up our taxes even more. Schools that want to do the right thing by having full-day pre-K programs are currently disincentivized to do that because they don't have the appropriate taxing authority for pre-K that they do for K through 12 students. Public schools are stepping into the void left by a porous mental health system to try and triage for children in our state. And we can bring in principals anytime. We can tell you about kids that are on waiting lists for months. I was out on the phone talking just a few minutes ago with a principal who had a student that was referred in August, came from a hospital program, came to her school in northern Vermont, and just came back to the school a few days ago after finally being placed in a placement last June. Stayed a kid for almost a year. Kid was physically restrained every day. Kid was attacking teachers, attacking support staff, just wasn't getting what they needed. They finally get the kid in a program how to stay. Now the kid's back in their school as a para-educator, not a super trained person, just helping the kid, working with the kid, and the kid's doing fantastic. But needed that therapeutic placement for about 3 months to have any ability at all to access the kid's education. So it's pretty interesting that if these kids can get what they need, sometimes that's all it takes, and maybe it doesn't have to be a permanent insertion, maybe something that can be fixed and helped. And this kid is medicated differently and things like that too, but it took them months of training to get to this point. And the school didn't have the facilities to do it. It had to be a private organization. Transportation and contracting costs, I don't know if somebody's mentioned that to you, those are right through the roof right now.
Tell us a little bit more about that.
What's that?
Tell us a little more about that.
Well, for example, like bus contracts and stuff will sometimes have automatic inflators based on the number of miles you're driving or how hard it is to hire drivers.
Yeah.
Hiring people to do contracted work because you can't hire employees. So for example, if you can't hire employees to do speech language pathologist work and you're hiring and contracting out, the cost is much, much more per hour. And school districts are required to pay for those services because kids have them in their plans. We find a very high number of small public and private schools. This is the big one, right? With taxpayer dollars for the relatively small amount of students we have in the state. This is a continued cost driver, and it's going to be. At some point, we're going to have to deal with it. That may mean we may eventually have to have less schools. Hopefully, less schools that are better facilities, structures. But at some point, that's going to be the big conversation we're going to have. And then I just touched on unfunded mandates and gave examples such as PCBs, public dollars financing private entities, universal meals. Not that any of those things are bad, but they all are drivers. And I just wanted to list for you as many drivers as I could think of. And subject to that, I'm open for any questions, Senator.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, Senator Sheen.
Thank you for all of that. Regarding financing private entities, can you do a little bit more of a dive into why that's increasing costs for everything?
Sure. So for example, let's say I don't have a preschool in my town and I'm sending money to a private business to pay for preschool services that my town can't do within my school, for example. That's money that's going to that private entity. I gave you the SLP example. That's another perfect example. I can't hire an employee, so I'm contracting with, in some cases, an out-of-state company that's doing, not therapeutic, not the right word, virtual training with me because I'm having trouble saying, and so maybe I'm getting training online with a speech language therapist, but it's being paid for a private business as opposed to an employee that I hired. And those always cost more money. Spending money, public taxpayer dollars, going to a private school when I have my own public school nearby. Anytime we do anything like that, it adds to the overall cost of money coming out of that public education fund. That's what I'm talking about. Anything like that, whether it's good or bad, it is a driver. Just like universal meals. I'm gonna have very many people are gonna sit in this room and say to you guys, oh, that was dumb. But it is a cost, and it's an unfunded mandate. Some schools are looking at, do I wanna fund universal meals if I had the choice? Would I fund that? Or would I fund that extra reading teacher because I think that my school could afford to pay for the meals? Those are just examples. You're welcome.
Are some of those because you can't find staff?
Absolutely.
And they
It's
are
hard
always
reality.
more, well, everything you just mentioned is always more expensive.
I don't know if it's always more expensive, but
It's
anything
just-
that drives up the cost overall. Like a good example would be when I was in Alberg,
Yeah,
as a teacher,
yeah.
we would have kids go to New York, well, they still do, a lot of kids go to New York for high school, and their tuition is lower. So from
That's
the
right, yeah.
Alberg budget point of view, they look at it like, oh, our budget's going down a little bit.
Yeah.
But in the greater scheme of Vermont budgeting, money's being sent to another state. So that hurts all of us overall because we have money leaving our system, our economy, going to another economy. Same thing when we send kids to Canada.
They don't have a school in Alberta, so what happens?
Alberg doesn't have a high school, and there's a school in New York that's actually just as close as MBU or St. Albans.
I think up in Rutland County, there are a lot of kids that go over there's some town that doesn't have a high school. And I think it goes over to the public high school. I think that happens
Yeah, they go to New York. They cross the bridge and go over to Granville, New York.
in New Hampshire too. There's a school.
And some in Massachusetts where we have some kids that will go that live on the border.
Yeah.
Right now, Vermont law, if I live in towns like that, Berkshire's like that. We don't offer a high school. So Berkshire kid can go anywhere, literally, get the state average pay. So Berkshire kid can go to Phillips Exeter if they can find a way to get there. That's money that's leaving our state, going to another state or another private entity.
You have a high school in your town?
We got 70-something high schools in the state of Vermont.
I thought you guys had something.
Now, Enosburg High School and Richmond High School are close by. but
That's.
Any other questions?
I have a comment.
Yeah, please. Boston, just one quick. Is the secretary standing out there? No, okay.
Okay. I just wanted to say that, and I think I can say this safely and anecdotally, that we lost a great principal to the private sector. And,
A great principal.
yeah, I mean, I know that, I'm sure the pay was better in the private sector, but I also, think that one of the things that she said was that the amount of paperwork that she had to do in terms of reporting just got to a point where it was untenable. And whether it's special ed reporting or Title IX or whatnot, it's
Spent a lot of time with it.
it's a lot,
These
yeah,
are not
yeah. And I think it's hard for educators to go into the profession really to work with kids, and then they end up locked in their office reporting. So
Agreed.
I'm not making a, judgment on reporting or not reporting, but it's just something that we should think about as we're trying to make a profession more, attractive.
Paperwork reduction act of some sort would always be
It's a
helpful.
tough one.
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, did that person, is it state and federal or is it a combination of the four?
That's a good question.
I think
Probably both.
it's probably both, but I really do think, Vermont, we tend to have, yes, we add lots of layers to everything.
I think there was actually a superintendent who, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think he represented or covered the White River Junction area and also part of New Hampshire. And I think one of the points that he raised was just the paperwork level is much nicer on the other side of the river compared to Vermont.
Yes.
Does that sound about
Fair
right?
Williams.
Yeah.
Okay,
Thanks a lot.
of course,
Good to see
anytime.
you.
Yeah, plan's been lots of quality time here. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, I think the secretary, let's get started. We know that Jess is on Zoom, so we'll let her in. And hopefully the secretary will either be with her or be walking down the hall.
Otherwise, I'm ready to go anytime.
Yeah, let's just take 2 minutes, is that all right? Just quick 2 minutes. I'm just gonna
2 more minutes.
track down secretary. So in Emily Lesh. She might, yeah.
Yes,
talking about?
We'll hear about your kids.
Yeah,
So I'll get my questions in.
yeah, you will. Well, I mean, I hope so.
It's a long time. Here's my question. What do we need you for?
Yeah, I mean, we.
This mandated to do it, why do we need another?
And then really more importantly, because I'm a nurse,
But can we just turn the agency
the
and say
second
why
document
don't you do
takes the legislative
this?
planning
Write
section.
another bill?
So there's the paragraph of the.
Let's
planning
ask the experts that question. Cynthia.
You're reading it, so I missed the
Well, when we get to it, we'll ask.
I'd love to see it, yeah.
We're wondering why we need this.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, which is a good question. It's a good question.
If we need it, I'd be glad to sign on.
Yeah, it's a good question.
We need a law to say.
Nobody wants more
do your
laws,
job.
right?
This is the critical one, as far as I'm concerned.
There's the great reasons.
Yeah.
As, anyway, I wish you luck.
Are you looking for Senator Campion or?
Don't call it.
Oh, bye, have a good weekend.
Yeah, you too.
Thanks.
So what are the 2 or 3 things they don't know about us?
That's what
It's
they,
typically what happens.
that's what they told me. James, he said to me, I agree with everything, but I have too much respect.
Yeah.
Yeah, my necktie.
You know,
Yeah.
You know, in
No. Well, I have a-
Star Trek, they were no longer wearing neckties. You know, we didn't, in the future.
Hey.
Yes.
In
the pandemic we were.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, see, the Hall students, they don't even have to wear a jacket.
Wow, really? We're so
stupid.
Right,
So stuff.
no electronic devices.
Very uptight.
It's all because it's blue. How are you?
Oh, no, I think there's, no,
Jeff?
I think there's a
Looking
chair.
for a chair. Oh, you've got one over there.
Yeah. Oh, did I buy you? Excuse me.
Got it?
Oh, can you call? Thank you.
Let's wait for Senator Sheen and we'll get started. Isn't that great?
Yeah. I don't know if the chair shared with you yesterday that I couldn't talk to them.
Oh, no, I did not share that
Well,
one.
it's because it's been a while since I've been doing this, so you know what I think it was? I think it was when you were on appropriations,
Uh-huh.
and I was thinking of you.
I was
as
on
your chair.
finance
On
forever.
finance,
Yes,
but it was
yes.
at the end.
It was at the end.
And so
Oh,
I was like, what am I doing?
Yeah.
And you've been on Zoom a lot, so, yeah.
Yeah, and it's, I still remember like when, you know, where House Ed was actually a testimonial. Is that a bad thing to bring up?
It's a huge deal. Are we live, sir?
hope so. I don't think
I was gonna comment on the artwork in that room, but I
I
won't.
didn't realize that we're recording.
Senator Sheen was about 60 more seconds.
Yes, did you say 2 minutes?
Stretch.
On air right now?
No, we're off.
Okay.
Off, yeah.
So,
Oh, of course it is.
I'm not talking about our literacy